The night Sector 9 went dark. Commander Kale Voss was 3 fingers deep into a bowl of cold noodles and watching the rain dissolve the last of what they used to call a city skyline. She set down the bowl without looking away from the window. Rain meant atmospheric interference. Atmospheric interference meant the listening grid was half-blind. And a half-blind grid on a night like this, when the Vorkai supply fleet was scheduled to pass within 12,000 kilometers of the station, meant that whatever happened next was going to be her problem. It always was. She pulled up the incident report before her second-in-command. Reyna could get halfway through knocking on the frame of her open office door. "Sector 9, Kale said. Reyna stopped. "How did you?" "Because Sector 9 is where they always start." Kale pushed back from the desk and reached for her jacket, the one with the cracked left shoulder plate she hadn't gotten around to replacing. "Relay went dark 11 seconds ago. Either it's a malfunction or it's a probe, and we don't have the budget for malfunctions." She looked at Reyna properly now, young, sharp-eyed, perpetually about 3 seconds away from asking a question she wasn't sure she was allowed to ask. "Get the unit together. Full kit. All 9 of them, all 9. Reyna disappeared down the corridor. Kale pressed her knuckles against the cold glass and looked out at the rain. The Vorkai hadn't come to this planet in 18 months, but they hadn't left either. They were patient in a way that made human impatience feel like a survival trait. The kind of patient that let them sit in orbit for a season, cataloging what you had, mapping who you were, charting the architecture of everything you depended on, and then, when the grid blinked for 11 seconds, slide in like water under a door. She'd learned that. The hard way, twice. She wouldn't be learning it a third time. The unit assembled in the vehicle bay with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this enough times that ceremony felt like insult. 9 women, varying in age and origin and the specific texture of their exhaustion, checking gear with the economical focus of mechanics on a deadline. They called themselves what the Vorkarkai called them, the Keth Allah, the persistent ones, the humans who refused to process fear in productive ways. The original Vorkai term carried a note of biological puzzlement, as though the aliens had encountered the concept and set it aside as a file type their systems couldn't read. KL had taken to wearing the word like a title. She walked the line the way she always did before a deployment. Not inspecting, not commanding, just present. She touched Della's shoulder. She exchanged a look with Priya that said 3 different things at once. She stopped at the end of the line where Sona stood with her helmet already on, visor up, because Sona was always 2 steps ahead of everyone else, and had the hypervigilance to prove it. "Feeling philosophical tonight?" Kale asked her. Sona tilted her head. "Feeling ready. Good enough." Kale put her own helmet on and sealed the collar. The heads-up display populated atmospheric data, local comm signal strength, heart rate, the little amber dot in the upper right corner. That meant the listening grid in Sector 9 was still offline. She stared at that dot for a second. Something about it bothered her in a way that wasn't tactical. The grid had been online for 4 years. It had survived a firestorm, 2 Vorkai probe runs, and a catastrophic software failure that had kept the senior technical team locked in the server room for 11 hours, with nothing to eat but emergency ration bars, and a portable speaker playing the only playlist they'd all agreed on. It had never just gone dark. "Wheels up in 4, she said. "We're not going in loud." The Vorkai didn't build things the way humans built things. They didn't build for scale or vanity or permanence. They built for function, with the bare minimum aesthetic of a culture that considered beauty to be a cognitive inefficiency. Their forward installation, because that was what it was, Kale realized the moment they crested the ridge, and she saw it in the valley below through the green haze of her night optics, had been constructed from prefabricated units in roughly the same time it would take a human crew to unload them. It was maybe 40 meters across, mostly flat. The surface of it absorbed radar and scattered light in that specific way she recognized from the technical briefings she'd sat through before this whole situation had become a permanent condition of her life. "They're not listening," Sona said from beside her. "They're always listening. No, I mean right now." Sona pointed at the ridgeline to the east, where a secondary relay should have been humming. It wasn't. "They took out the grid so they could work without us overhearing. Whatever they've got down there, they don't want us to know they have it." Kale lowered her scope and thought about that. The Vorkai had, to this point in the conflict, been many things. Methodical, overwhelming, occasionally cruel in that clinical way that made humans argue for hours about whether it constituted malice or mere indifference. But they'd never been secretive. Their entire operational doctrine was built around certainty. They announced their presence. They cataloged. They evaluated. Secrecy implied uncertainty, and the Vorkai, in Kale's experience, did not do uncertainty. Something had changed. "We need to know what's in there," Kale said. "We need to know what's in there without them knowing we know," Sona said. "Can you get a feed from the installation's secondary EM signature without triggering their perimeter sensors?" Sona was already working on it. That was the thing about Sona. She didn't wait to be asked. She'd been building a passive intercept device from scavenged components for the better part of 3 months, largely because she couldn't sleep and needed something to do with her hands. She called it the Sieve. She hadn't been asked to build it. She hadn't briefed anyone on its specifications or its capabilities. She'd simply built it because she'd noticed a problem, and it seemed like the kind of problem a device like that could solve. Kale had spent exactly 40 seconds being irritated about the lack of protocol and the rest of her time being grateful. The Sieve came out of Sona's pack and went to work, pulling threads of electromagnetic signal from the air with the patience of a spider in wind. It took 6 minutes. Kale spent those 6 minutes watching the installation through her scope, counting the number of times a Vorkai sentry passed the same point in its patrol route. 16 seconds between repetitions, precise to the point of mechanical, which either meant they were machines or they were so certain of their security that they'd stopped caring about the variables. Either one told her something useful. "Got it," Sona said, voice flat with the particular concentration that meant she was processing something she didn't fully like. She passed over the earpiece. Kale pressed it in and listened. It took her a moment to understand what she was hearing. The sound was dense, layered, like every conversation happening within a kilometer radius of the installation, compressed into a single signal, stacked and sorted and cross-referenced in real time. A voice she recognized from 3 days ago, 2 kilometers away, discussing the water filtration schedule. Another voice from the field hospital, talking about medication dosing in the specific tones of someone who thought they were completely alone. Tactical frequencies that should have been scrambled. Command decisions that hadn't been finalized yet. All of it flowing in clean and clear. "They built a collector," Kale said. "An omnidirectional acoustic intelligence harvester," Sona said. "Range is probably 8 kilometers minimum. Maybe 12. Everything in that radius. Every frequency, every conversation, every encrypted channel. They're pulling it all in." She paused. "It's the cleanest signal capture I've ever encountered. The resolution is," she stopped. Started again. "Kale, if they've been running this for more than 48 hours, they've heard everything." The weight of that landed exactly the way she knew it would. Every extraction route, every fallback position, every medical supply location, and every encrypted protocol, and every name. "Della," Kale said quietly into her unit channel. "Here, get back to the base. Right now, alert Reyna. Nobody transmits anything, not a heart rate monitor, not a status ping, nothing, until I give the word. Go." A pause. Then the sound of Della moving, fast and quiet, through the dark. The argument that followed, when Kale brought the unit back to base and explained what they'd found, was exactly as structured and professional as every argument in a crisis situation. Which is to say, it sounded less like a meeting and more like a pressure valve finding a release point. Reyna wanted to hit the installation directly. 2 of the older members of the unit, Tamsin and Kress, both veterans of the first Vorkai contact event and survivors of the Red Point evacuation, argued for strategic withdrawal and denial of all classified channels. Priya, who had spent 3 years before the conflict as a signals analyst and still had the perpetually overstimulated look of someone who processed information faster than she could use it, sat in the corner of the room, drawing diagrams on a scrap of recycled paper, and not saying anything. Kale let them argue for 4 minutes. Then she looked at Priya. "You're drawing something." Priya looked up. She had the expression of someone who'd arrived at the answer 20 minutes ago and had been quietly waiting for the room to catch up. The device uses a passive broadcast to amplify its collection range, which means it has an active component running underneath the passive one. An emitter. Tiny, probably no bigger than your fist. But it's there, and if you can get within 10 meters of it, and if you had something that could generate the right interference frequency. "The Sieve could do that," Sona said. "If you inverted its collection function, yes," Priya said. Instead of pulling signal in, you'd be pushing a targeted disruption out. It would look like natural atmospheric degradation to their sensors. The device would interpret it as a local interference event and attempt to recalibrate. And during recalibration, it would have to drop the collection buffer, Kale finished. For approximately 12 to 15 seconds, Priya said. Long enough to get inside without triggering the acoustic perimeter. Not long enough to do anything stupid. I do lots of things in 12 seconds, Sona said. That's the concerning part, Priya replied. Kale stood up and looked at the installation schematic Sona had mapped from the sieve data. 40 meters across, 16-second sentry rotation. One emitter, fist-sized, running underneath a passive collector that was currently harvesting every unguarded word spoken within a 12-kilometer radius, including, she noted, this conversation. She crossed the room, picked up a power cell from the equipment bench, and used it to smash the passive transmitter on the wall unit. Not dramatically, just efficiently, the way you'd close a window against the rain. Everyone watched her do it. We're going to assume, she said, that they've heard everything up to this point. We plan accordingly. She set the power cell down. Raina, pull the extraction routes. All of them. We're treating them as compromised. Sona, rebuild the sieve with Priya's inversion spec. I want it ready in 2 hours. She looked at the rest of the unit. We're going to make them recalibrate. And when they do, we're going in. The rain had stopped by the time they moved out. The night had that particular quality of cold silence that came after rainfall, when the world was too wet to make sound and the air was still and the dark felt closer than usual. They approached the installation from the north, through the drainage channel that hadn't been on any official map because Della had surveyed it herself 3 weeks ago, during what everyone else had assumed was an extended equipment check. Della had a habit of doing useful things without explaining her reasons, which Kale had long since stopped trying to discourage. 40 meters. 30. The sentry completed its rotation and moved away. 20 meters. Sona adjusted the sieve and looked at Kale. Kale gave the signal. The disruption pulse went out, silent, invisible. A whisper of wrong frequency folded into the atmospheric noise like a single wrong note in a long piece of music. The kind of thing you'd feel before you'd hear it, if you were listening for it at all. 12 seconds. They moved. The interior of the installation was exactly as cold and functional as the exterior implied. No wasted space, no gesture toward comfort, everything oriented toward operation. Banks of processing hardware lined 2 walls. The collection device itself sat in the center, roughly cylindrical, matte-surfaced, humming at a frequency just below audible with a depth that you felt in your back teeth. Sona was already crouched over the emitter housing. Priya knelt beside her. Kale stood at the entrance and watched the sentry rotation through the gap in the door, counting the seconds. 8, 10, 13. Sona, working. Sona, I said I'm working. 15 seconds. The recalibration window was closing. The sentry was 30 meters out and coming back. Kale pressed her back against the wall and breathed through her nose, the specific breath she'd learned to use when the situation narrowed down to a single point and everything else fell away. Not calm, exactly. More like stillness within motion, the way a river goes quiet right before it goes over the edge. Done, Sona said. She held up the emitter, fist-sized, exactly as Priya had calculated. It had come out of the housing in one piece, which meant the collection out device had just lost its amplification range and was currently running on passive only. Local collection only, maybe 50 meters, with no way to tell the Vorkai command what was happening. They were out before the sentry completed its next rotation. What Kale hadn't accounted for was that the Vorkai already knew. Not everything, not the specifics, not the routes or the names. But they'd known the device would eventually attract attention, and they'd planned for the attention in the way they planned for most things. Not by preventing it, but by using it. The communication came through on a general broadcast frequency. 11 hours after they returned to base, the Vorkai signal pattern was unmistakable. That dense, layered carrier wave underneath a voice that translated into something that wasn't quite language and wasn't quite music and sat uncomfortably between the two. The translation came through the system in flat text. Kale read it standing at the communications desk with Raina beside her, and Priya watching from across the room. The message said, "The device has been disabled. Return it, or we will begin a sequential elimination of your communications infrastructure. 1 relay every 4 hours. Starting with Sector 3. Raina said something that didn't need to be written down. Kale read the message a second time. The thing about the Vorkai, the thing she'd tried to explain to Command 17 months ago in a briefing that had been politely received and then ignored, was that they were not, in any meaningful sense, evil. They weren't malicious. They were methodical in a way that went deep enough to look like cruelty, but was actually closer to indifference filtered through absolute certainty. They had decided, through a process that their own cultural documentation described as the evaluation, that humanity was a managed variable, not an enemy, not a partner, a factor to be accounted for. The message wasn't a threat, it was an equation. Kale folded the printout and put it in her jacket pocket, next to the cracked shoulder plate, in the same general region where she kept the other things she'd decided not to lose. How long to build another emitter, she asked Priya. Longer than 4 hours, if Sona helped, Priya considered. Longer than 4 hours, right. Kale sat down on the edge of the desk. Then we're not building another emitter, we're giving them back their device. She looked at the room. With modifications. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Not resistance, not agreement, but that particular quality of attention that meant everyone in the room was recalculating at the same time. The emitter is out, Sona said slowly, but the collection housing is still functional. It is, Kale said. If you reinstalled the emitter with a secondary oscillation layer, a narrow band layer, tuned to their own transmission frequencies, Priya said, catching up. She looked faintly alarmed in the way she sometimes did when a plan assembled itself in real time, and she liked it more than she expected to. It would collect normally on the surface, but underneath it would push a continuous disruption tone through their command frequency range. She stopped. They'd lose coherent communication across their entire local network, not jammed that they'd detect, just degraded progressively, like atmospheric noise that never quite stops. How long before they traced it? Depends on how much they trust their own equipment. Priya paused. They trust their own equipment a great deal, Kale smiled. It wasn't a large smile. It was the specific kind she'd developed from moments when something had revealed itself to be exactly as solvable as she'd suspected. Sona, she said, build me a bad gift. They delivered the device back through the same drainage channel, at the same hour, in the same configuration of cold and dark. Kale went herself. She didn't have to. Raina argued pointedly that she didn't have to, but there was something about the specific act of delivering a broken thing that she wanted to do personally. She left it at the installation's primary access point, which was the Vorkai equivalent of a front door. She set it down in the rain. She looked at the installation for a moment. Matte surfaced, functional, built without a single gesture toward beauty, humming at a frequency she could feel in her back teeth, and thought about all the conversations it had collected, and all the conversations it had not collected, and all the conversations it was about to never collect again. She walked back through the dark, through the drainage channel, through the wet cold, and the particular silence that follows rain when everything that was going to happen next hasn't happened yet. Priya had calculated 3 days before the degradation became noticeable. It took 2. The Vorkai command network across the sector began losing coherence on the morning of the second day. Not dramatically, not a failure, not a shutdown, nothing that would look like an attack. Just noise. The kind of noise that came from a universe that didn't always organize itself according to expectation. Signal quality dropped 4%, then 8, then 14. Orders took longer to confirm. Confirmation sequences required reruns. The precision that made their doctrine work, the 16-second sentry rotation, the cataloged certainty, began to accumulate small errors the way a long calculation accumulates rounding drift. By the third day, the sector installation had gone quiet. Not dark. Kale was careful to distinguish this. The Vorkai were still there. They were still capable. They hadn't been defeated in any clean sense of the word. What had happened was more specific and more human than that. They had been made uncertain. And uncertainty, in a doctrine built entirely on certainty, was not a manageable variable. It was a file type their systems couldn't read. The debrief lasted 2 hours. Command wanted specifics. How long the disruption would hold, what the likely Vorkai response would be, whether the modification could be replicated at scale. Kale answered what she could answer and declined to speculate on the rest, which generated exactly the friction she'd anticipated and felt no particular urgency to resolve. Afterward, Raina found her in the vehicle bay, doing the thing Kale did when she needed to think, which was to check and recheck the gear she already knew was in order. They'll figure it out, Raina said, not challenging, just stating. Yes, Kale said. Probably within a week, probably less. Kale ran her thumb along the cracked shoulder plate she still hadn't replaced. That's not the point. What is the point? Kale considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. The rain had come back, softer now, the kind of rain that didn't announce itself. They built a device that could hear everything, she said. Every frequency, every conversation, every encrypted channel. 12-kilometer range. Designed to remove uncertainty from a system that runs on certainty. She set down the jacket. The point is that we took it apart, rebuilt it, handed it back, and it's currently making them less certain than they've been since they arrived. Not because we're stronger, not because we had better technology, because we know how to use a broken thing. Reyna was quiet for a moment. Sona wants to build 3 more sieves, she said. She says she can tune each one to a different band. Tell her yes. She already started. Tell her yes anyway. Reyna smiled. The small, efficient smile of someone who'd stopped being surprised and started just keeping track and went back inside. Kale sat down on the vehicle bay floor, with her back against the wheel housing of the largest transport, closed her eyes, and listened to the rain on the roof. Somewhere in the sector, the Vorkai were running their recalibration sequences for the 4th time in 3 days, and finding the same result they'd found the 3 previous times. Noise. Not an enemy, not an attack. Just the universe being imprecise. She pulled the printout from her jacket pocket. The Vorkai message, translated into flat text. Return it, or we will begin a sequential elimination. She looked at it for a long time. Then she took out a pen, a physical pen, which she kept specifically for moments when she didn't trust anything electronic, and wrote 2 words at the bottom of the page. We did. She folded it back up and put it away, and sat in the rain noise, and thought about nothing in particular for the first time in what felt like a very long time. Across the sector, in the other installations and the relay stations and the field positions and the forward outposts, things were continuing in the way they continued, with effort, with improvisation, with the particular texture of daily life in a conflict that had no clear horizon. People fixed things, people argued, people kept schedules and lost equipment, and found solutions to problems that hadn't been anticipated because nobody had anticipated this particular situation, and so every solution was being built from pieces that hadn't been designed for it. Sona built 3 more sieves, tuned to different bands, and then built a 4th one because she'd figured out a modification halfway through the 3rd and wanted to test it. Priya ran signal analysis on the Vorkai degradation data and produced a report that was 40 pages long and contained, somewhere in the middle, a finding that she flagged in amber because she wasn't sure what it meant yet. Della surveyed 2 more drainage channels that weren't on any official map. Tamsin and Kress argued about something tactical and then stopped arguing and made tea. Reyna updated the extraction routes. Kale slept 4 hours, which was more than she'd slept at one time in the previous week, and woke up feeling approximately as rested as a person could feel in a situation like this, which was not very rested, but was enough. And enough had always been what she worked with. The Vorkai continued their recalibrations. The noise didn't stop. 3 weeks later, a Vorkai diplomatic signal came through on a frequency that hadn't been used in 14 months. The translation was longer than the previous one. It contained, buried in the middle of a dense sequence of positional declarations, a phrase that Priya translated as, "The evaluation parameters require revision," which was, by the standards of a culture that communicated the way the Vorkai communicated, an extraordinary thing to say. Kale read the translation twice. She passed it to Reyna. She waited while Reyna read it and set it down with the specific careful movement of someone handling something they didn't want to drop. "Papameter require revision," Reyna said. "Yes, I know what it is." The room was quiet for a moment. Through the window, the sector had the gray light quality of early morning, when the sky was the same color as the ground and everything looked temporary. "They built the device to remove uncertainty," Kale said, "and we gave it back in a way that made them uncertain. And after 3 weeks of uncertainty, they've decided they evaluated wrong." She picked up the translation. "That's not a surrender. It's not a ceasefire. It's more like..." She stopped, thought about it properly. "It's like they ran a calculation and the result didn't match the model. And now they have to go back to the beginning and figure out where the model was wrong." "How long does that take?" Reyna asked. "I have no idea," Kale said. "But it takes longer than we gave them credit for, which means we have time." She set the translation down. "Use it." She put her jacket back on, still cracked at the shoulder, and walked out of the office, down the corridor, through the vehicle bay, and outside into the gray morning light. The rain had stopped again. The ground was wet. The sector was quiet in that particular way that meant things were still happening, just below the frequency you could hear without the right equipment. She thought about the device sitting in the Vorkai installation, running its collection function on passive mode, hearing everything within 50 meters, pushing its narrowband disruption tone through command frequencies that were slowly, incrementally, irreversibly losing their clarity. She thought about Sona's fourth sieve, which nobody had officially authorized, and which was almost certainly the best piece of improvised signals hardware that had ever been built in a vehicle bay at 2 in the morning by someone who technically should have been asleep. She thought about a culture so built on certainty that they'd never developed a protocol for being wrong. Then she thought about everything she'd ever fixed with parts that weren't designed for the job, in situations that hadn't been anticipated, with people who'd never stopped showing up. The morning was cold and wet and uncertain, and she was standing in it, which was, all things considered, exactly where she was supposed to be. She pulled her collar up and went back to work.